Hi, welcome to the Week 2 Forum. This week we are looking at Chapter 2 of the text, which covers the founding of the country and the U.S. Constitution. Broadly speaking, this week we're analyzing the colonial period with a focus on the causes of disagreement among the colonists and the Crown that led to the Revolutionary War and American independence, as well as the interregnum period under the Articles of Confederation and the defects of the Articles of Confederation that led to calls for a constitutional convention. The text also addresses the various compromises that resulted in the newly proposed Constitution and the arduous ratification process that produced a series of vigorous debates among the states, or in the states, I should say, that ultimately resulted in ratification of the Constitution. We tend to look at ratification as a foregone conclusion, but the vote in several of the more important states like Virginia and New York were very close. And either of those two states rejecting ratification would likely have produced a very different outcome. Chapter 2 additionally addresses the amendment process, which sets a very high bar for changing the basic principles of our constitutional regime. I'm a political theorist by training, and as a result, I find political influences of the framers to be very interesting. The English social contract theorists like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke left an important imprint on the framers' approach to constitution writing. The very idea of government as a contract advances the notion of limited government. Locke's ideas on the right of rebellion was clearly an important aspect of the founding generation's justification for the Revolutionary War. Jefferson's statement in the Declaration of Independence that the colonists enjoyed an unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, borrowed directly from Locke's second treatise on government. The only real ad lib is Jefferson's substitute of pursuit of happiness for Locke's argument that a right to property was a natural right. Many of the framers also had read the French philosopher Montesquieu's arguments regarding the desirability of a separation of powers and drew on his analysis in drafting what we describe as the constitutional institutions of the federal government, with Article 1 dedicated to Congress, Article 2 for the executive, and the more vaguely worded Article 3 for the judiciary. I've always found the Constitutional Convention to be a fascinating subject, and one of my favorite books is Catherine Drinker Bowen's Miracle at Philadelphia, which was published in 1966. Think about the compromises that the convention delegates were compelled to make in order to create a workable government. Some of those compromises actually set the stage for later conflicts, particularly the Three-Fifths Compromise, which essentially codified slavery as a legal institution for the first 74 years of the Union and really gave the South greater voting strength than their populations merited and frankly violated the principle of one person, one vote. The first thing we need to acknowledge is that the Constitution created a much more powerful government than had previously existed, but that the power of the federal government remained sharply delineated. And the system of checks and balances was designed to compel the federal government to only act in instances where near consensus had been formed. The genius of the constitutional system that the founding generation created is that it generates a system in which interests are balanced against other interests. The secret of the system's stability over time is in maintaining that balancing act. Unfortunately, we're seeing in our politics a lot of impatience on both sides of the aisle or on all sides of the aisle. And there's a willingness on the part of some to impose their will on everyone else. To me, the dangerous thing that we're seeing in our politics is a willingness to probe the boundaries of our constitutional system and undermine some of the key institutions that are essential to sustaining that sense of balance. The question for all of us is whether that constitutional balance can be maintained, or indeed whether there are enough Americans of goodwill across the ideological spectrum who care more about the rule of law and upholding the Constitution than they do about their tribe winning, whatever that means. Key to understanding the debates that shaped the Constitution is the distinction between Federalist delegates to the Philadelphia Convention and those anti-federalists representing mainly the smaller states who feared that their states would lack influence if the Articles of Confederation were jettisoned in favor of a system of government with a much stronger central government. The compromises made, at the Constitutional Convention, especially the Great Compromise, continue to influence American politics today. Because of the creation of a bicameral legislature, small, low population states continue to have outsized influence over the passage of legislation. And citizens in states like Oklahoma actually exert far greater voting strength than citizens voting in large population states like California and New York. The ratification process was a lot more difficult than most people imagine. There was a very real possibility that enough states would reject ratification, and that without some real effort on the part of the Federalists, in some instances some pretty unscrupulous efforts, if I might add, ratification might have failed. Those efforts by the Federalists ultimately helped form the nucleus of American political thought in the form of the Federalist Papers, which began as newspaper columns, calculated to attract popular support for ratification in New York. But they've endured as some of the clearest statements of the governing principles of the founding generation's political beliefs. Chapter 2 introduces several key constitutional principles this week. The idea of federalism, which we'll address in detail next week, reflects the idea that a decentralized system of government where power is shared rather than monopolized by one institution was less likely to become tyrannical. The notion of the separation of powers likewise reflects this concern with any one institution becoming too powerful. The late political scientist Richard Neustadt argued that it was a misnomer to describe the American Constitution as setting up separation of powers. To him, the system of checks and balances meant that the Constitution created separate institutions sharing power, which again gets back to that notion of balance and the emphasis on a great deal, the need for a great deal of trust and willingness to compromise in order to govern. Unfortunately, trust and willingness to compromise is currently lacking these days. The process for amending the Constitution is also an important topic. The framers correctly, I believe, recognized that the Constitution would require occasional updating and changes, but they again put in very stringent requirements for changing the basic rules. As a result, beyond the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments, there have only been 17 amendments over 227 years, the last of which was declared ratified in 1992. Well, why is it so important that changes to the Constitution's, kind of rules of the game require almost universal agreement? What's the likelihood of a successful constitutional convention in the current hyper-partisan environment? So there's a lot to cover this week. Which aspect of this chapter did you find most interesting? Which subject did you think was most important? Which constitutional principle or historical fact from this chapter did you find most hard to comprehend? I hope we can have a great discussion this week on the Constitution and come out of it knowing more about the Constitution than when we came in. Let's have a great week.